any kind of store, like a grocery store, whatever, that had um, toys, any kind of toys. Okay, they didn't have to have a toy department. Just sometimes you go to grocery stores and they have toys, and they do that to drive parents crazy. I swear, you know. And he would always want to know where the toy department was. And I said to him multiple times, I said, Steve, stay with me. Do not wander off. Okay? Stay with me. Don't wander off. This one particular occasion, I was in the store with him, and he was alongside of me, and he began to kind of walk, and he went down to the end of the aisle, just a few feet, turned the corner, came back down the other aisle, and he was looking for the toys. No surprise there. I stayed where I was, and I was actually able to look up over the top of the shelves in my aisle to his aisle. And suddenly he turned around and he couldn't see me. And like I said, about 3 or 4, and he got kind of scared. He said, Dad, Dad, and I did not answer. And he got really scared. And he kind of walked up and down the aisle, and he started to cry. It seemed like probably half an hour to him. It seemed like a long time to me, but it was just a few seconds, and I waited. And I came around the corner, and I said, Steve? And he turned around, and he was very happy to see me, and kind of weepy at the same time. And I said, didn't I tell you not to wander off? Yeah. And the point of that story is this. He thought that I had left him. He thought that he was all by himself. All the evidence that he could see. Look up the aisle, look down the aisle. At that moment, apparently, all the toys in the world didn't mean as much to him as the security of knowing where Dad was. That's a good feeling. Okay? I always feel a little manipulative, but it's still a good feeling. You know, I can justify it. He was never out of my sight the whole time. Never out of my sight. There was virtually no way anything bad was going to happen to him, and if it did, I would have seen it, and I would have been able to control it and deal with it. But he was never out of my sight. He was never out of my ultimate protection, no matter what he thought and felt at that time. Now, I did that, I'll be honest with you, and to be honest with you, just you can see, I did that to teach him a little bit of a lesson. Now, I can ask you this question. Have you ever been in a situation where God seems afar off? If you have never been in a situation where God seems afar off, then you've never really lived. You've never really seen life. You've never really seen what the book of Ecclesiastes refers to as life lived under the sun. Ecclesiastes is a fascinating book. I was thinking, as I told you last week, one of our students, one of our outstanding young men at Cornerstone was tragically lost his life in a drowning accident a couple of weeks ago. And that's the sort of thing, and my response to that to some people was, it put me in an Ecclesiastes sort of mood or sort of mindset. The book of Ecclesiastes confronts us with the idea that most of the time we probably think that we have this thing called life figured out. Usually it comes from the idea that, well, if we obey God and live righteously, God will bless us and do good things for us. But if we disobey God, then he will abandon us and he will leave us and all that sort of stuff. So my level of prosperity or my level of adversity are both directly proportional to how obedient I am. Now, the wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and even the Song of Songs, teach us that that is not necessarily the case. There are all sorts of lessons that we can learn by going through those times when it seems like God is not there. We've all been through them. Some of us may be going through them even now, where it just seems like God is afar off. So what kind of lessons is God trying to teach us? I think one of the lessons that he would teach us is that he is always there. Well, in fact, verse 14 says as much. You see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. But it doesn't always seem that way to the psalmist. It didn't seem that way to my little boy when he was a little boy. He's not a little boy anymore, a lot bigger than I am. Um, but it didn't seem that way to him at that moment. And we all have times when God seems far off. Remember, the Psalms show us that we can take every emotion we have into the presence of God. Question, misunderstanding, asking God why. I had an older gentleman at my previous church once ask me, I've always told people never to ask God why. Am I wrong to do that? And I, bolstered myself and I said, quite frankly, yes, you are. Because the psalmists do it all the time. Why? Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the kind of background things that lead up to us. I was reacquainted in my study this week with a term that I've seen before, and that term is called practical atheism. You ever heard that term? Okay. Practical atheism. Practical in the sense that, what basically you're working on, what you're living out, what your life is characterized by. Atheism. Atheism, of course, is the belief that there is no God. There's two different types of people in this regard. One are people that are called agnostics, which comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means to know, and an agnostic doesn't know. An agnostic would say, there might be a God, and there might not be a God. I simply don't know. That's one type of person. In some ways, agnostics are a little more open-minded. They might say, I don't know if there's a God or not. I'm still looking for evidence, but I don't see the evidence. The atheist says, no, there is no God. And the Bible has a lot more to say, really, I think, about atheists than it does about what we would call agnostics. The Bible says the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. Remember in Psalms, a fool is always a person who is not simply intellectually deficient, a person who thinks that 2 plus 2 equals 5. The fool is someone who shakes his fist in the face of God and said, I will not have you to reign over me. I will do my own thing. So, practical atheism. Now, there's two ways to talk about this, and the second one is the one I want to spend more time on. Sometimes we as believers in God are guilty of practical atheism. We're not atheists. We do believe in God, but we're a whole lot more comfortable believing in God when things are going well, right? When there's enough money in the bank, when I'm healthy, when all of the basic questions and comings and goings of life are under control. I love having things under control. I'm not a control freak. I really don't think I am, but I do like having things under control. I have Quicken software on my computer. I love Quicken financial software. I can check transactions. I can download transactions. I literally balance my checkbook every day, and I do it by playing on a computer. It's pretty cool, okay? But I like having that control. I was here a couple of months ago, and some of you know this, and I was just getting ready for the service, and my phone rang, and it's from an out-of-state number. Most of the time, I just let those go to voicemail, because most of the time, they're just, telemarketers, whatever. This time, for some reason, I answered it. And they said, is this Andrew Smith? And I said, yes, it is. Do you have an account, the credit card, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, I do. Okay. Well, did you, and so I'm like, you're not getting any information, you're not getting any numbers or any dates or any passwords, nothing like, don't ever do that, by the way. Don't ever do that. I know that you know enough not to do that. But I'm going to say it again. Don't ever do that, okay? Mr. Smith, did you use your credit card at a Home Depot in Champaign, Illinois to buy some stuff? I said, nope. They said, well, someone did, and someone also used your account at another store in Illinois to buy some other things, and we were able to catch that one, but the second one we didn't, so it was $115.06 or something like that. And I offered to throw in the 6 cents, but I said I want the $115 back. No. But it was like, all of a sudden, I didn't have control. All of a sudden, it's like, well, how much of this, are there more? Are there going to be more? And they assured me, oh, we shut down the card, we shut it down, it's not able to be used anymore. But when God does not seem to be in your life, and when you've lost control, that's when it becomes frightening. And so you and I can often be practical atheists. We go to church on Sunday, we listen to some outstanding music, we interact with each other, we fellowship, we praise the Lord, we do all those wonderful things, and then we walk out to the parking lot and our car won't start. And it's like, why do these things always happen to me? Right? Always. First time I can't remember. I shouldn't say this. I shouldn't say this. I'm going to say it, but I shouldn't say it. I can't remember the last time my car didn't start. Now, the one I'm going to start in another half an hour, 45 minutes or so, I bought from Jerry Peterman. So, if it doesn't start, Jerry in the crosshairs, okay? And yet we say this always happens to me. Well, nothing always happens to anybody. But there are those times. And so how quickly we don't look at a situation like that and say, oh, I wonder what lesson God is trying to teach me through this. And we don't stop and pray, oh, Lord, I can't, Lord, help me, please. Help me to get this fixed, please. We're like a little 3-year-old boy who wanders away from his father and doesn't see him and thinks he's abandoned him and begins to act terrified when, in fact, Daddy is watching him all the time. So God is watching. So let's not be practical atheists. If I sat you on a chair and I said, do you believe in God? You say, yes. I said, you believe God loves you? Yes. Do you believe God will never let anything happen to you that you can't handle? Yes. I could run you through that whole list of questions, and you would give me all the right answers. Boom, boom, boom. But let me ask you this. The first time that trouble or struggles or difficulty come into your life, how are you going to respond? Don't be a practical atheist. Now, the opposite of practical atheism is theoretical atheism, attempting to prove that God does not exist, right? Practical atheism is simply acting as though God doesn't exist. Anybody can do that. It's like a person who is married can act like they're not married, which is usually inappropriate, unacceptable. But those are the possibilities. Now, theoretically, Psalm 10, right? There are people who are genuine atheists, and they're atheists because that's their conviction. Those are theoretical atheists. That's what their belief system is. And there's all kinds of people like that in the world, and some of them are very famous, as you'll see in a moment. Okay? Now, it is actually what's really more dangerous than theoretical atheism is that practical atheism is really more dangerous to all people involved. The person that you can reason with, the person that is willing to debate you, okay, that's not so bad. But it's the wicked man in Psalm 10 that he's a practical atheist. He doesn't care. He just refuses to believe. If you were to take the man that is described in Psalm 10 and sit him down and say, okay, I'm going to give you all the arguments for why I know God exists, he wouldn't care. He's not the least interested in that. He just wants to take advantage of you. He wants to steal. He wants to rob. He wants to mock God. The late comedian George Carlin, who is very much a shaper of kind of Western culture and Western thought. George Carlin had a number of routines, comedy routines, which you can find on YouTube, but I'm going to caution you, there's a lot of profanity in them. Just be careful as I look around. But at one point in one of his routines, he adamantly insists that there is no God, and he says, if there is a God, right now, may he strike, and then everybody thought he was going to say, may he strike me dead, but he said, may he strike everybody in this audience dead, and then they all laughed. And at one point in the routine, he says, nope, there is no God, there never was, there never has been, there never will be, there is no God, period. And it got really, really quiet. This was not in a church, okay? This is in a theater with a comedy concert going on, right? Now, the wicked man in Psalm 10 does not argue, he simply acts. It's sort of like, think of it this way. Let's say you're asleep in your bed in the middle of the night, and you hear some noise, you hear some glass break, and a door open or whatever, and you walk in, and you confront a burglar who's armed, and he's got a bag of stuff, and you try to sit down with that person and say, okay, I know you broke into my house in the middle of the night, but have you really thought this through? Have you really thought about the practical implications of this? Have you ever thought about, you wouldn't want me to come to your house and steal your stuff, would you? Well, no. Okay. You wouldn't want me to, and then you try, as though this conversation is going to end with the burglar saying, I'm sorry, I don't know what I was thinking. Send me a bill for the broken window and the broken door, and we'll go from there. Like that's going to happen, right? This is not what this guy is up to. That's not what the wicked man in Psalm 10 is up to either. The wicked man in Psalm 10, if I can say it, is hell-bent on making sure things are the way that he wants them to be. He's not interested in having any kind of conversation or discussion. Now, there has been a time, there was a time, and I think it's largely gone. I'm not an expert on cultural trends, but I do observe them pretty closely. And there's one thing I think I can say. This idea that our culture and our society is open to an honest debate about whether or not God exists, an honest debate about whether or not Christianity is true. I think that point of view is long gone. Have you been on social media lately? Okay. There was a debate that took place. Oh, my picture didn't show up. Okay, not sure why that is. I had a picture of two fellows. You can see their names there. Father Frederick Charles Copleston, who was a British pastor, theologian, philosopher, who taught at Oxford. And then Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was a famous philosopher. He wrote probably his most famous book is called Why I Am Not a Christian. Right? And there was a debate that aired on the BBC back in the 60s, I believe it was, between these two. And it was massively watched. Okay? All kinds of people watched it. Because people back then were interested in rational, serious debate about things like, is there a God or is there not? I think we've largely moved away from that in our culture. People are living their own lifestyle, and they don't want to believe. This is why Paul says in Romans chapter 1, that unbelievers suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The unbeliever's problem in Romans 1 is not that they can't understand about God, they simply don't want to believe in God. Because if there is a God, they know that they're in trouble. They deny a belief in God to justify their lifestyle. And that's what this fellow in Psalm 10 does. I want to show you an example. You may be familiar with this. Let me make sure I get it right. This is, for some reason my picture's not showing up this morning. There's a fellow named Richard Dawkins. Okay, Richard Dawkins. Okay, not to be confused with Richard Dawson, who hosted Family Feud. Okay, Richard Dawkins. Okay, Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. Well, that sounds like a real courteous way to approach believers, doesn't it? To write a book called, hey, you people that believe in God, you're a bunch of nuts. Okay, you're deluded. Okay? And this is one of many quotes from the book that Richard Dawkins says. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Notice his use of the word fiction. Dawkins says the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Can't believe I said all those words. Okay? So, Richard, tell me, what do you really think about the God of the Bible? You know, don't soft soap it, don't soft pedal it here. Just tell me what you really think. Okay? No, it's pretty obvious that there's no room left here for dialogue. In fact, Richard Dawkins has said at one point, I think he's kind of backed off that now, but he said that Christians aren't just wrong and kind of goofy and crazy. They're actually dangerous, and they have to be dealt with. Okay, that's interesting. That is precisely the attitude of the person in Psalm 10. Now, the psalm starts off with this statement. It says, why, Lord, do you stand afar off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And that's a couple of rather strong accusations, wouldn't you agree? But this is the psalmist being honest. This is the psalmist taking every emotion into God's presence. This is like the psalmist saying, I feel. Sometimes, and it's not easy to do, but sometimes the best conversation that a married couple can have, for example, is, I don't know what your intentions are, but this is how you're making me feel. That can be, if done right and done properly, that can be the beginning of a healing process, okay? Where all the cards are on the table, okay? All the cards are on the table, okay? I feel like the pastor who said he was going to give up playing cards, and he expected everyone in the congregation to follow suit. Okay? Think about it. It'll work its way back to the back there. Okay. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself? It's not just that God is perceived by the psalmist here as indifferent, but God is actively running away. When my son was in the other aisle in the grocery store when he was 3 years old, I literally, I was still watching him. I didn't run out and get in the car and drive home. I didn't hide myself somewhere. I literally was there, okay, which was scary enough for him. This is what the psalmist does, okay? The psalmist's state of mind is that he feels that God is a long way away. Not only does he believe that God is far off, but he believes that God is hiding himself at the worst possible time, in times of trouble. In the 3 years plus that I have been here, I've had conversations with people who are going through some tough times. And it's like, of all the times now, okay, I got so many things going on, and yet God is allowing this to happen? And they're asking those questions. And it's okay to ask those questions because the psalmist does. It might sound disrespectful, but it's honest, okay? So my question to you this morning, and you don't have to answer this out loud, obviously, but my question to you is, have you ever felt like that? Okay? Have you ever felt like God has just left you? That God is far off? That God doesn't care? That he's actually not just standing a long way away, okay, but that he's hiding. He's deliberately staying away. I remember I had an experience. I don't know if I ever told you about this or not. I had an experience where I must have been about 4 years old because we were still living in England. And I was in the store with my mom and dad looking at the toys. Speaking of looking at toys, right, it's a guy thing. Okay? Just when we get older, our toys get more expensive. And I was walking, looking at toys, and I was holding my mother's hand, and walking along, and I saw some toys, and I played with toys, It's cool. Okay? I want to see more. So I reach out, grab my mom's hand, and I keep walking, And I'm walking out of camera range here. Sorry about that. So I looked up to see my mom, and I saw this old lady's face, okay? I'm sure she was a very sweet lady. She was smiling at me, But I looked up, and I looked down the aisle, and I saw my mom and dad just standing there looking at me, grinning from ear to ear, okay? So my parents are smiling, and this old lady is smiling at me, and I went, okay? I felt like they were playing a dirty trick on me. And they were, okay? You ever felt abandoned? Okay? Damn, I must have been deeply damaged by that because that was like 57 years ago. So when I get to heaven, I'll say to my mom and dad, why'd you do that? Okay. But yeah, have you ever felt that way? You ever felt abandoned? Now that was nothing. That was more benign than my incident, and nothing was going to happen to me, but it scared the life out of me. The arrogant words and deeds of the wicked person are given to us in verses 2 through 11. Listen to what this person does, this wicked person does. This is the person that for the time being has driven the psalmist over the edge. He's made the psalmist believe that God is indeed standing afar off and that God is actually hiding himself in times of trouble. He says, in his own arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak who are caught in the schemes he devises. He boasts about the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. Reminds me of Amos when he says, that woe to those who call good evil and evil good. In his pride, the wicked man does not seek him, that is to say, seek God. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. His ways are always prosperous. So he's a person who completely debunks the idea of God, and yet he's got all kinds of money. He's got all kinds of wealth, all kinds of reputation. He's healthy. He's strong. His life is going very well, and yet he has absolutely no time for God. In fact, he mocks God, and he harms those who believe in God. His ways are always prosperous. Your laws are rejected by him. He sneers at all his enemies. He says to himself, nothing will ever shake me. He swears, no one will ever do me harm. His mouth is full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush, he murders the innocent. His eyes watch in secret for his victims. Like a lion in cover, he lies in wait. He lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed. They collapse. They fall under his strength. He says to himself, God will never notice. He covers his face and never sees. So this is what this person believes about God. They speak out threats, and they act on those threats. These are not just idle threats. when my son was quite young as well, he was older than 3, but he had been, he was out. Well, he hadn't been out that day. He'd been with me the whole time because we had to go some places. And I got a phone call about 9 o'clock at night. Hey, from some guy who's obviously drunk. Hey, your kid was in my yard this afternoon, and he threw a rock through my window. I said, that's not possible because he was with me the whole time. Yeah, he was. Is this? And he said my name. I said, yeah, that's me. He said, your kid. I said, no. And he said, yeah, it was. And if I ever see him again in my yard, I'm going to kill the, expletive deleted. And I said, no, I'm sorry, that's not the case. And I said, if you don't stop calling, I'm going to call the police. Well, fortunately, there was another guy apparently in the house that says, who talked to me, and, this guy was obviously drunk. The other guy wasn't. But it's scary, Now, I knew that this guy was just, I could tell he was drunk. He probably wasn't going to do anything. And probably if you told him the next morning what he did, he would deny it or he'd feel embarrassed by it. But still, it's scary. When someone threatens to kill your child, literally or in a drunken stupor, it's not fun. The wicked person threatens and acts, he's boastful. He issues threats and carries them out. Perhaps worst of all, he says in verse 11, God will never notice. He simply covers his face and never sees. So the psalmist is interested really in 2 things. He's interested in his personal protection, but he's also interested in the vindication of God, that God will indeed rise above this. Okay? In verses 12 through 15, the psalmist cries out to God for intervention. He asks that God not forget the helpless. He says, arise, O Lord, lift up your hand, O God, do not forget the helpless. In verse 13, he says, why does the wicked man revile God? Why does he say to himself, he won't call me to account? Verse 14, where the psalmist begins to get his thoughts together, and he says, but you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. The victims commit themselves to you. You are the helper of the helpless. The psalmist speaks the truth about God. That's what we need to do. We need to know what the truth of God is. Okay? There may be times, and there may be times right now, but there will be times where in your life and in my life we will feel as though God is not there. I remember I was listening, my wife and I are on the way back from West Virginia, and you listen to Sirius XM radio a little bit, and then you listen to Les Mis, which is cool. Always like to listen to Les Mis in the car. And then my wife has the Narnia Chronicles on audiobook. So we pop in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and listen to that for an hour or two. And I always remember when Mr. Tumnus, the faun, is describing Aslan, the lion, the Christological figure of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he assures little Lucy that Aslan is good. He is most definitely good. But he's not safe. He said, what do you mean by that? He's not safe, okay? He does what he does. He doesn't answer to you or to me. He simply calls upon you and me to know and to trust and believe that he is good. At another point at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Mr. Tumnus again says to Lucy, he says, Aslan is good, but he's not a tame lion. What do you mean by that? He's not a lion that we can tell him what to do. God is not a God that we can tell him what to do. Wouldn't that be wonderful if that were the case? If you ever seen Bruce Almighty, the movie, you know a little bit about what that movie, everybody gets what they want. And when everybody gets what they want, they become God and not God. And it becomes a disaster in the film. Well, it's the same thing. Okay? The psalmist affirms the truth, what he knows to be the truth about God, despite the circumstances. I know, it's amazing how Israel forgot about God after the Exodus, after they saw the 10 plagues, they saw the manna in the well, saw the water from the rock, they saw all the provisions that God has made, and yet they get out in the desert for a little while, they face some trial, they face some adversity, and what do they say? Gee, Moses, why'd you bring us out here? Weren't there enough graves in Egypt? You want us to die out here? At least in Egypt, yeah, we were slaves, but we had, onions and garlics, and at least we had some fruits and vegetables. At least we had a salad bar for lunch in Egypt. All we have here is this manna, this manna. And manna, it's a Hebrew word. It means, what is it? What is it? That's because when they walked around, they said, what is it? What's it? What's that? What's that? And so, what are we having for dinner? We're having, what's it? What's that for dinner? Okay. Really? Again? Again? Manna for breakfast, manna for lunch, manna for dinner, liquid manna, frozen manna, toasted manna. Manna, manna, manna. That's all we got. Let's go back. These were the people that just a few months ago said, oh, Lord, please get us out of here. We can't take it anymore. So God does that. And what do? They complain about that. The psalmist speaks the truth about God. The psalmist calls upon God to intervene against the wicked. Sometimes you and I are tempted to do our own intervention. Sometimes you and I like what I call Clint Eastwood Christianity, right? So do you feel lucky, punk? That's a lousy Clint Eastwood impression, I know, but it's fun, okay? Get off my lawn, kind of. That's sort of the way we want to take it into our own hands. We want God to be the agent of our justice. Lord, see those people over there? Yeah. They did this to me. Well, go get them. Okay? Sick. No. God is sovereign. Aslan is not tame, and he's not safe. And we need to place our trust. God has lessons. I had a lesson. I was trying that day to teach my son a lesson when he was 3 years old. Don't wander off. That's what I was trying to do. And I wanted to get his attention. And it worked for a little while, You know how 3-year-olds are. But that's the way it is. God wants, the trials and the struggles and the pains that you are going through. Maybe God is trying to refine you. Maybe God is trying to teach you some lessons. Maybe he's trying to teach you to understand who he is. Maybe he's trying to teach you to trust him more. Sometimes a weak faith has to be destroyed so the stronger faith can take its place. Sometimes we need to honestly attempt to understand just who God is and what is it that he's trying to teach us. The last 3 verses of this psalm, Psalm 16 through 18, the psalmist speaks of the truth of God's character and claims his promises. Verse 16, it says, first of all, the Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his hand. From his land. The truth of the Lord's eternal kingship and its implications. What does it mean for God to be who he is? God is doing all sorts of work in our lives and in the lives of believers all around the world. You and I do not set the agenda for how God teaches us and what God teaches us. You and I trust him. We allow him to lead us. We allow him to go. And that's going to mean that sometimes we're going to go through things that we don't understand. And there may be times, and there's sort of been some times already where I've sat in hospital with people, and they've said essentially, Pastor, why is this happening to me? And I have to say, in all honesty, I don't know. I can't tell you. But I can tell you this. God is faithful. We need to trust him. His ways are beyond our ways, as the heavens are above the earth. That the most foolish thing that God can think is wiser than the most wise thing that you and I could ever come up with. And God has a plan. And, that's when I encourage them to practice 20/20 vision. Look back. Look back. How many times in your life did you think that you were just up against it? And yet God delivered. How many times did you think, oh, this is what I want, God. Why won't you give me what I want? And God doesn't give you that, but later on he gives you something better. Or you find out that if God had given you that thing, it would have been destructive to you. And yet we forget that, don't we? We just forget that so quickly. God hears the cry of the afflicted and encourages them. Verse 17, you, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry. He also says that God defends the fatherless and the oppressed, so that mere earthly mortals will never again strike terror. You and I don't have to be afraid of anything or anyone. We never know from day to day what kinds of things are going to impinge upon the church. We don't know what kind of physical health challenges we're going to face. We don't know what kind of financial challenges we're going to face. We don't know what kind of threats from society we're going to face. We don't know when an issue in the culture will rise up in such a way that the way that we do church may fundamentally change. Right now we live in a country where religious organizations like churches and parachurch organizations are exempt from taxation. What do we do if that changes? Okay? I tell you what, we'll better change. If the federal government decided, or the state or whatever, and they passed attacks on this building, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. But we're not really in trouble because we're still the body of Christ. We just find another way to serve, that's all. Not going to get rid of us that easily. Oh, we might not have some of the comforts that we've had. We might have a little different experience of what it means to be First Baptist. Might have a little different experience of what it means to be the Church of Jesus Christ, whatever it is. That might change. Maybe sometimes that's what we need. Maybe we need to be shaken up, yeah, a little bit. Maybe we need a little change outside the normal routine. Maybe we get too complacent. Maybe it's formulaic. Well, if I just obey God and do this and push buttons A, B, C, and D, God will always respond in a nice way. God is like my employer. The paycheck comes twice a month. Just always there. Sometimes it's not. What are the lessons that God is trying to teach us? So, thoughts to take with you. Have you ever felt like God was afar off? I can assure you that God will test us in that way, in those kinds of ways. He has done so, and he'll probably do so again. That things will come into our lives that we will not be able to explain. They defy explanation. That's real comforting, isn't it? It's real assuring. But I also want you to know that God is still on his throne. He is still Lord, and he is still in control. I would like to say, in my weaker moments, that God should answer to me. That's not how God works. That's why he's God, and I'm not. But I simply obey, do what he says, and I trust him. And even in those times when it seems like he's afar off, I know that ultimately he is the one who sees the trouble of the afflicted, who considers their grief, who defends the fatherless and the oppressed, and that I don't have to be afraid of mere mortals. I don't know what your specific situation is that you're going through right now. I know that God is there, even if you can't see him. He is there even if you can't hear him. He is there even if he doesn't seem like he's there. He is there for you. It's okay to ask the question. It's okay to pray. Because really, that's what verse 1 is. He's talking directly to God. He doesn't say, why, O Lord, does the Lord stand far off? Why does he hide himself in times of trouble? Like he's asking other people the question. No, he says directly to God, why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? A lot of us, we think if we talk to God like that, he'd zap us. And the fact is, the psalmist can speak that way because he's being honest. He's speaking from the heart, and God already knows he's thinking that. So why try to be less than honest with who he is? Those are the challenges that we face. There are psalms that are wonderful psalms. Oh, God is so great. God is so good. He's blessed me in this way. He's blessed me in that way. And we have times when we feel that in our lives as well, don't we? God's just blessed me so much I can't even contain it. And then there are going to be times when God feels like he's far off. But I can assure you, he's not. We must go through the struggles that the author of Psalm 10 went through. And trust and honor and glorify him, even when we don't understand. Because after all, the Bible doesn't call us understanders. The Bible calls us believers. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for its truth. Lord, probably every one of us in this room has had a point or a time in our lives when we felt as though God was standing afar off. He was actually hiding himself from us. Lord, we've gone through those times, and they've been painful and they've been difficult. But Lord, you have a message for us, and you are a God who never abandons us. You always care for the oppressed, the fatherless, and the widow, and you watch over and protect them. And we have nothing to fear from your mortals. Lord, honor and glorify your name in our midst, and help us always to trust you. We pray this in